This episode sponsored by Game of Thrones Legends. Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and here's my long-awaited review for this epic miniseries, based on the true story of the worst nuclear disaster in history. In the early morning hours of April 26, 1986, two explosions rocked the Vladimir E. Lenin power plant, better known today as Chernobyl. First, a steam explosion ripped apart the Unit 4 reactor. Then once the core was exposed, a second, larger explosion tore the building apart, spewing radioactive material and nuclear fuel around the reactor hall and into the air. Initially, much of what happened at Chernobyl was kept a secret from the world. The Soviet Union, desperate to contain the news, ensured that the information given was limited and the narrative controlled. But when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, some classified documents were made available, and the world finally learned what really happened. And historians, authors, journalists, and filmmakers have been putting the pieces together ever since. The show's writer and creator, Craig Mazin, wanted to make this series as historically accurate as possible, while still telling a compelling story. In his own words, Chernobyl
is a story about the cost of lies. For me, this was an important kind of story to tell about the value of truth versus narrative.
But how much of what we see in Chernobyl is actually the truth? And does the show fall into the trap of glossing over it to tell a particular narrative? Well, join me as I take a look at HBO's epic miniseries. I'll dive into the real history behind this nuclear disaster and reveal what the show got right and what it got wrong. This is Chernobyl. So the show begins by introducing us to Valery Legasov, a Soviet academic with a doctorate in chemistry. And though Legasov once ran the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, a prominent Soviet nuclear research group, he was not a specialist in nuclear reactors, but he was a well-respected scientist within the Communist Party and in the global scientific community. He's best remembered for spending 2 years working to contain Chernobyl's fallout and debris, both physical and political. And this show opens up at the end of those 2 years, and the end of Legasov's story with his death. And the audio recording we hear being played here is a great setup for the story this series wants to tell.
What is the cost of lies? It's not that we'll mistake them for the truth. The real danger is that if we hear enough lies, then we no longer recognize the truth at all. What can we do then? What else is left but to abandon even the hope of truth and content ourselves instead with stories?
Now, it's important to note that these powerful opening lines were not part of Legasov's real audio tapes. They were completely made up for the show. The real Legasov recorded 5 tapes in April 1988, 2 years after the explosion, to document his thoughts and actions during his time at Chernobyl. The transcripts have been meticulously translated from Russian, so it's an odd choice to just make up content when there's so much they could have used. But regardless, the nod to these tapes is a nice touch. We start off with a clear idea that Legasov has regrets and doubts about how the Soviets handled Chernobyl, and even if we don't know anything yet about the event, we now know to expect some shenanigans, cover-ups, and lies. But the way he's presented in the beginning is just really inaccurate. Legasov finishes his final tape, looks out the window to see the KGB spying on him, wraps the tapes up, hides them in an alleyway, and then hangs himself. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's only been 6 minutes. First, let's talk about this apartment. The condition is not great. The implication here, especially once we learn more about this character, is that he was disgraced for speaking out against Soviet Russia and is now being followed. And even if this were true, he would not have been relegated to this kind of housing. The real Valery Legasov was pretty high up in the Communist Party and scientific community. As such, his housing would have reflected his status in society. This is his home in Moscow, on Petkotnaya Street, not far from the Kurchatov Institute where he worked. This is the home he lived and died in alongside his wife, not the cramped apartment we see in the show. And while on the subject, what's also been changed has to do with Legasov's wife and his adult children. They are completely absent from the show. Mazin explained this decision in the Chernobyl podcast.
So there's a number of things here that are absolutely accurate to history, and then some things that I fiddled with a little bit just to be able to tell the story. So here's a good, right off the bat, let's talk about what's real and what's not. One thing that I've left out of Legasov's story, and it's left out right off the bat, is his family. He had a wife, he had children. And I made a choice early on to not include them in the story, mostly because so much of this story was going to be about his efforts in Chernobyl and his relationships with the people that he was fighting this war with.
Fair enough, Mazin is condensing personal history for the sake of the larger story, but that doesn't explain why he changes so many other facts. I mean, there's no evidence to suggest Legasov was being stalked by the KGB. In fact, until the very end, Legasov didn't publicly go against the party line about what happened at Chernobyl. Instead, initially, he spent his time trying to improve Soviet nuclear technology, but that didn't happen, and he was sidelined from the academy for eventually blaming the Soviet system for allowing a disaster like Chernobyl to happen. And that was when he committed suicide. But his suicide was on the 27th. Not the 26th, as the intro card tells us. It was 2 years and a day after the explosion. And those tapes weren't hidden in an alleyway either. They were recorded for Legasov's friend Vladimir Gubarev, a science editor at the Pravda newspaper. Though the tapes were initially confiscated, Gubarev got them back, and though heavily censored, some of the content was published. So this whole narrative that the KGB was stalking him as he rotted away alone in a shabby apartment, it's just bollocks. But you know what? The rest of the first episode more than makes up for this. Because watching things unfold after the reactor exploded was mostly accurate and very gripping. We don't find out what caused the explosion until the last episode of the show. Mazin wanted to start things off with a bang. Literally. So our introduction to the power plant is the immediate aftermath of the explosion. But I won't make you wait until the very end to understand what went wrong. On the night of April 26, 1986, Anatoly Dyatlov, deputy chief engineer, was overseeing a safety test that was years overdue. Back when the fourth reactor was built in 1983, the plant manager, Viktor Brukhanov, and various other party members at Chernobyl signed off that it was done. But in reality, the test hadn't actually been completed. Much later, Brukhanov defended this decision, saying, as reckless as it sounds, this was fairly routine practice in the USSR, as completing work ahead of schedule entitled everyone involved to significant bonuses and awards. So even though the safety test hadn't been carried out, the reactor was made operational. Fast forward to April 25th, the day before the incident. Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin was ready to try the safety test again, the fourth attempt. It was originally scheduled for the afternoon shift. But Fomin was asked by nearby Kyiv party officials to delay the test, since they didn't want people to lose power in the middle of the working day. The afternoon shift were the ones who were briefed on the test and knew what to do, but now it would be up to the night shift. There were a handful of operators in the control room that night, but the show focuses on 3. The previously mentioned Anatoly Dyatlov, night shift foreman Alexander Akimov, and senior reactor control engineer Leonid Toptunov. Akimov was an experienced engineer. Dyatlov, though chiefly an administrator, had plenty of nuclear expertise. Toptunov, though, while he joined the Chernobyl plant as an engineer in 1983, he had only been operating the reactor for 2 months. Neither Toptunov or Akimov had conducted this test before, and they were not properly briefed. The safety test manual, both in the show and in real life, was heavily annotated and hard to understand. So they relied heavily on Dyatlov's expertise to get them through the test. Without getting too deep into the specifics, they had to reduce the reactor's power levels to around 700 megawatts to run this test. But in the process, Toptunov made an error, and the reactor's control rods went in deeper than anticipated. The control rods help moderate the fission reactions inside the core, which are what generates the heat that powers a nuclear plant. This dropped the reactor power too low to do the safety test. In essence, the reactor was almost completely shut down. But Dyatlov was insistent that they carry out the test, even though the reactor didn't have enough power. The show gets this whole sequence correct. To get the reactor power back up, Dyatlov ordered Akimov and Toptonov to raise the control rods. With the control rods raised, theoretically, the power should also come back up. So Dyatlov had them remove all but 8 of the control rods, which was a huge safety violation. The absolute minimum allowed at the time was 15. But it worked to bring the power up a bit. Dyatlov carried on with his test. Now there's some debate over what happened next. Dyatlov himself said that the test proceeded as normal, so they initiated an emergency shutdown to turn off the reactor. Others suggested that there was more panic, as Akimov and Toptonov noticed something was wrong with the reactor power levels. But either way, Akimov pressed the AZ5 emergency safety button, better known as the scram, which automatically sent all the control rods into the core. By sending all the control rods in, the scram is meant to shut down the entire reactor, but this exposed a fatal flaw with the Soviet RBMK-1000 design. The control rods, tipped with graphite, would first increase the power before shutting it down. Only seconds after Akimov pressed the scram button, the graphite tips got stuck in the heart of the reactor core because of steam pressure. And the power levels were now several hundred times their capacity. 18 seconds later, that pressure, only increasing with the rising power levels, caused an explosion within the reactor, sending the 1,000-ton steel cover plate flying and exposing the core. This caused a second explosion, throwing nuclear fuel and radioactive material into the air, destroying the reactor hull and setting the whole thing on fire. The show does a brilliant job of showing us this whole process, and honestly, it's very accurate. From the faulty dosimeters that only showed a maximum of 3.6 Röntgen per hour, when the reactor hall was actually over 15,000 Röntgen per hour, to the control room itself, to the radioactive graphite chunks around the periphery of the building, the show excels with the visual and sound design here. I can see why Mazin wanted to start with this part to hook the audience. That being said, it does exaggerate and get a few things wrong though. The most absurd is the way they show how radiation burns. It's a bit over the top. In one scene, a man picks up a block of graphite, asking our main firefighter character, Vasily Ignatenko, what it is. Shortly after, he's on the ground screaming, and his hand is burned and bleeding. Now, it's true that being around all this radioactive debris was enough to get a lethal dose of acute radiation sickness, and many of the first responders ended up dying in hospital. But touching a piece of radioactive graphite with a gloved hand would not cause his hand to start bleeding this quickly. But I do appreciate that they showed how little protection the firefighters wore though. They didn't have proper clothing to help minimize exposure to radiation, not even a real respirator, and they worked at a nuclear power plant. And look at this scene. A senior mechanical engineer named Alexander Yushchenko props open a door to the destroyed reactor hall. When he moves away from the door, his hip and leg that were touching the door just start bleeding out of nowhere. According to radiation expert Dr. Alla Shapiro, a Chernobyl medical responder, it wouldn't have looked like this.
This scene is not realistic. Radiation will lead to bleeding if patient developed acute radiation syndrome with a bone marrow failure, but this would occur in the first weeks, never on the spot.
The real-life Yushchenko did get some serious radiation sickness from this, but he survived. Eventually, a whole host of higher-ups and party members meet to figure out the next steps. But what about the nearby town of Pripyat, built to house the plant workers and their families? Surely they should be evacuated too, right? I mean, even if it's not clear how bad things are yet, a nuclear power plant on fire is a serious problem. Well, it's at this point that senior party member Zarkov goes full Soviet, saying that the people need to be told to stick to their labor and not ask questions. This character, by the way, is completely made up for the show. Mazin defends this choice in the podcast, saying this.
That character represents a certain philosophy that was being brought to bear that night, a philosophy that goes all the way back to the Russian Revolution. I wanted somebody who represented that true belief in a dream of a utopia that never was going to be and never was, but who was still clinging to it.
I'll admit that Zarkov is a good storytelling device, but there were so many characters who were rank-and-file communists they could have used. But regardless, his speech reflected what happened next. They were afraid of the people panicking and word getting out about the explosion. Or perhaps in the words of someone who lived there at the time,
less knowledge, more silence, and less panic.
the one thing the Soviet Party wanted, above all else, was to save face and cover this up. There was no way they could admit to being technologically inferior to the West. To question Soviet science was to question the Soviet state itself. So to prevent this, as our fictional comrade tells us, Pripyat was sealed off and contained.
Cut the phone lines. Contain the spread of misinformation. That is how we keep the people from undermining the fruits of their own labor. Yes, comrades. We will all be rewarded for what we do here tonight. This is our moment to shine.
As Zarkov's words echo in the room, it's a reminder of the immense pressure to maintain power and control. In a strange way, it kind of reminds me of Westeros, where alliances, cunning and courage determine who claims victory. That's where Game of Thrones Legends comes in, a game that lets you step into the shoes of a Westerosi leader, forming legendary teams with iconic champions like Jon Snow and Rhaenyra Targaryen. In Game of Thrones Legends, you'll get to strategize in dynamic puzzle-based RPG battles. It's not just about brute strength, every move counts, whether you're pairing Arya Stark with Needle for maximum damage or charging up special abilities to set up powerful combos against your enemies. And as you progress, you'll be forging alliances, competing with fellow players, and exploring the stunning landscapes of Westeros, from the icy north to the fiery south. To give you a head start, download the game using the link in the description or scan this QR code and you'll receive exclusive rewards, 50 gold, 3,000 food, and a daily summon token to jumpstart your journey. So gather your allies and let's see if you have what it takes to secure your legacy in the Seven Kingdoms.
The building. The large dosimeter from the safe, the one with 1,000 Röntgen capacity.
What was the number?
There was none. The meter burned out the second it was turned on.
It's typical.
Here's what Moscow does. Sends us shit equipment and wonders why things go wrong.
This happened in real life too. The dosimeters they kept on hand only read up to 3.6 Röntgen per hour. The better ones were kept locked away. There were two of them at the plant. One was buried in the rubble after the explosion, and the second was in a safe. And just like we see in the show, once the men turned it on, the device broke. So they were certainly aware that the Soviets cut corners to save money. But despite how glib Brukhanov was here, these are party men, and they stood by the decisions of the communist state. They were told RBMKs were safe, and they believed it, so much so that Fomin confronts Sitnikov on what he's just told the group.
You're a nuclear engineer, so am I. So please tell me how an RBMK reactor core explodes. Not a meltdown. An explosion. I'd love to know.
I don't see how it could explode. But it did.
Had the scientists and officials who knew about the RBMK's design flaws bothered to tell his nuclear engineers, then the problem could have been fixed. Had Dyatlov known, maybe he wouldn't have carried on with the test once the power dropped to almost zero. So in this case, the entire Soviet system of not sharing all of the information in the fear of it undermining the state was a huge factor in Chernobyl's disaster. But before the show unveils that truth, it deals with the immediate fallout in the morning after. While the party officials are waffling back and forth about what happened, the majority of Pripyat citizens are still unaware of the danger looming towards them. Kids are out playing and going to school, women are chatting and catching up. Life went on as normal. The main concern was to shut Pripyat down, so nobody knew what happened. They didn't want people to start panicking, so they simply just didn't tell them. This continued well past when the party officials and those in charge of Chernobyl and Pripyat knew that radiation was descending upon the city. The show gets this part right. Next up, we meet Ulana Humyuk, a nuclear physicist working in Minsk, Belarus. And I need to get this out of the way now. Her character plays an important role in exposing the truth about what happened at Chernobyl and how the Soviet government was partly responsible for the carnage that followed. But I'm sorry to say, she's not a real person. The show tells us as much in the final credits, and Mazin explains why in the Chernobyl podcast.
There were hundreds of scientists that ultimately worked on the problem of Chernobyl. Valery Legasov, played by Jared Harris, was kind of the scientist in charge of this effort, but there were so many more who were involved. And in order to consolidate these many, many people into one, I felt I had to create a composite character.
So what that means, if we're talking about historical accuracy, is that any scene with Yulana is fictional, exaggerated, or changed. The show then brings us back to Pripyat in the hours after the explosion, and it's a mad scramble. Those who are first on the scene are bleeding and suffering, essentially cooking from the inside out. At one point, a nurse even interjects.
Much better than what?
No, stop, stop!
What are you doing?
These are radiation burns. Their clothes are contaminated. Help me!
She and the others start pulling off their clothes, where they are stashed away in the basement for fear of more radiation exposure. And this is all accurate. The firefighters' clothes can still be found in the basement of Pripyat's Hospital 126. Radioactive particles that fell on them as they worked to put out the fires still emit radiation to this day. And what's scary about this scene is watching the hospital workers, single file, dump these irradiated clothes into the basement. They didn't have protective equipment, they didn't shy away from the work, they did what they had to do to care for their patients, and many died as a result of acute radiation sickness. It's a stark reminder of the men and women who continue to do their duty in the face of death. Next, we get a pivotal scene where Legasov meets Boris Shabina, the first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. The two are sent to Chernobyl to investigate what happened, but the show gets the basic timeline and facts wrong. We see Legasov get a phone call from Boris Shabina and is told they are meeting to discuss the incident at 2 p.m. in Kyiv. In reality, Shabina and Legasov didn't arrive at the airport until later that night, and the meeting didn't start until around 10 p.m. I'm not entirely sure why the show gets this wrong, because the delayed response would actually support their argument about the Soviet state. The real Legasov woke up that morning and attended a party meeting in Moscow. It was at this meeting that he heard about Chernobyl and was later told that he was selected to serve on the government commission to investigate what happened. Now, changing how Legasov got the news doesn't really impact the show's narrative, so again, it's not clear why they did. When it comes to this scene, Mazin says this in his podcast.
The manner in which he kind of deduces that there may be something worse and the motivation to go there, this is a compression and combination of a number of events.
Yeah.
That the way that scene unfolds is my own interpretation of things.
Inventing characters like Zarkov and Yulana to condense multiple characters, and for the sake of pacing, fine, I get his interpretation. But when the real timeline exists and I can tell the story more accurately, that I don't. In any case, when Legasov arrives to this meeting, he's generally outraged that Shabina isn't taking this seriously. This part, at least, is accurate. The real Shabina was not ready to believe that the reactor exploded and the core was exposed, and this comes after several reports from other ministers that had seen it firsthand. One told Shabina that they needed to evacuate the local populations. Shabina's response was, quote, "Why are you being so alarmist?" Another told Shabina that the reactor was gone, and Shabina responded with, "You're a panicker. How are you going to evacuate all these people? We'll be humiliated in front of the world." And that is the gist of what we see in this initial meeting in the show. The meeting itself, however, isn't that accurate. I mean, for one thing, Gorbachev wasn't actually there. He phoned in sometime after midnight to get a status report. Legasov, who we see slam the table and interrupt the meeting, would not have done this in real life. And it wasn't Legasov who was adamant about the exposed core, it was other ministers who had arrived early and toured the ruins of the 4th reactor hall. So this was all just dramatized to establish Legasov as the hero from the start. And while I'm nitpicking, Legasov is only here because he's supposed to be the expert in how nuclear reactors work. But the real Legasov specialized in chemistry. I mean, he was a well-respected scientist and a good choice for this committee, but he wasn't a nuclear guy. So the pair heads for a helicopter where Legasov breaks down how a nuclear reactor works. This is done for the audience and Shabina's character, but the science is accurate and is a good layman's description of how nuclear fission works.
In a nuclear plant, we use something called fission. We take an unstable element like uranium-235, which has too many neutrons. A neutron is
The bullet.
Yes, the bullet. So, bullets are flying off of the uranium. Now, if we put enough uranium atoms close together, the bullets from one atom will eventually strike another atom. The force of this impact splits that atom apart, releasing a tremendous amount of energy. Fission.
From the helicopter, Shabina and Legasov fly near the reactor hall, and Legasov can instantly tell what's happened. The core is exposed, and there's graphite on the roof. Shabina doesn't seem as convinced and wants to fly directly over the smoke billowing out, but luckily the pilot listens to Legasov and veers away at the last moment. However, again, the timeline is wrong. Legasov and Shabina did get in a helicopter together to get a closer look at the destroyed power plant, but it wasn't until the following day, and after Shabina decided to evacuate the city. When they land, Legasov and Shabina meet up with Brukhanov, Fomin, and Colonel General Pikolov, who was in charge of the military unit stationed at Chernobyl to help with containment and cleanup. Here, the show makes it seem like they still won't face up to the truth, but in reality, they knew it. They were more concerned with making sure the truth didn't get out. To find out once and for all, they put a better dosimeter on a truck and drove it close to the reactor hall to get a more accurate measurement. The meter confirmed for everyone the reactor core had in fact exploded. But in reality, it wasn't done in the middle of the night. And it wasn't General Pikolov who did it. But now, at least for the show versions of these characters, there is no more time for denying the truth.
It's not 3 Röntgen. It's 15,000.
Comrade Savina.
What does that number mean?
It means the core is open. It means the fire we're watching with our own eyes is giving off nearly twice the radiation released by the bomb in Hiroshima. And that's every single hour, hour after hour. 20 hours since the explosion, so 40 bombs worth by now. 48 more tomorrow, and it will not stop. Not in a week, not in a month. It will burn and spread its poison until the entire continent is dead.
With that, Shabina has Fomin and Brukhanov escorted to party headquarters and arrested. And as Fomin's being dragged away, he cries out, "It was Dyatlov." In part, yes, Dyatlov also made errors, but Fomin and Brukhanov were also found at fault for what happened. But in reality, they weren't arrested until much later on, August 13th, several months later. And Mazin even owns up to this in the 3rd episode of his podcast, so I'm sure he just felt it made more sense for his narrative since we don't see them again until the trial in the final episode. So with that squared away and those in charge now very clear on the issue, they get to work with containment and cleanup. But it won't be easy.
Fire. You don't understand. This isn't a fire. This is a fissioning reactor core burning at over 2,000 degrees. The heat will instantly vaporize the water.
How do we put it out?
You are dealing with something that has never occurred on this planet before.
Now that Legasov and Shabina are on the scene, they focus on containing the fission reactions happening in and around the exposed reactor core. In both the show and in real life, they decide to have helicopters drop boron and sand on top of it. Boron to absorb the neutrons causing fission reactions, and sand to smother the fires. And as Legasov admits in the show, most of it is going to miss, because the helicopters can't fly directly over the core. And speaking of flying over the core, you know that scene where the helicopter gets too close to the fire and falls out of the sky? Well, the title card tells us it's the morning of April 27th. And while it's true that bags were being dropped that morning, in real life, that helicopter crash didn't happen until much later on, during the liquidation phase of the cleanup in October. Here's the real footage, and as you can see, there was no billowing smoke from the reactor core. It just hit the crane. But apart from that, the show's portrayal looks remarkably similar, and it's a pretty cool visual too. Eventually, Shabina makes the call to evacuate the city. It happens, in part, thanks to this rather frank conversation between him and Legasov.
There are 50,000 people in this city.
Professor Ilyin, who's also on the commission, says the radiation isn't high enough to evacuate.
Ilyin isn't a physicist.
Well, he's a medical doctor. If he says it's safe, it's safe.
Not if they stay here.
We're staying here.
Yes, we are. And we'll be dead in 5 years.
But in reality, like I said before, Sabina had already made that decision, so this is all just for drama. The show also makes it seem like evacuation happened only once the world learned about it, but that timeline is wrong as well. A title card and accompanying broadcast tells us that around 2 p.m. on April 27th, 36 hours after the explosion, a Swedish power plant detected levels of radiation from the atmosphere. Now this did happen, but it wasn't until the morning of the 28th, and by then, evacuation had already begun. But anyway, now with the people out of harm's way, the cleanup efforts can properly begin. And it's just in time, because things could potentially get much, much worse. By dropping sand on the exposed core, Legasov anticipated that the temperatures would actually rise. The uranium fuel, in combination with the sand, boron, and other elements at play, would create a lava-like substance called corium. It's actually what the infamous elephant's foot is made of, a massive smooth flow of corium that seeped into the basement of the ruined reactor hall. To this day, the elephant's foot continues to put out lethal amounts of radiation. But the problem is that Legasov made an error in his calculations. In the show, Yelena is brought to Legasov and Sabina when she attempts to sneak into Pripyat during the evacuation. And she tells Legasov that he's making a mistake with the sand and boron.
Smothering the core will put the fire out, but the temperature will eventually increase. It will melt down.
I'm perfectly aware. But I estimate at least a month before it melts through the lower concrete pad, which gives us time.
No, you don't have a month. You have approximately 2 days.
The group then discovers that water is pouring into the facility from valves manually opened in the hours after the explosion and from the firefighters still trying to put out the fires. Basically, if this superheated corium reaches the water in the basement, it wouldn't be put out by the water. It would explode the hydrogen and oxygen atoms apart, leading to a massive steam explosion that would be even worse than the initial one. It would be enough to blow up the entire plant, including the other 3 reactors, exposing even more nuclear fuel to the air.
The release of radiation will be severe and will impact all of Soviet Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarusia, as well as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and most of East Germany.
What do you mean, impact?
For much of the area, a nearly permanent disruption of the food and water supply. For Belarusia and the Ukraine, impact means completely uninhabitable for a minimum of 100 years.
Now, of course, since Yelena isn't a real person, this whole meeting isn't entirely accurate. But the problem was very real. Legasov noticed that the temperature was rising on May the 1st, only a few days after the incident, so they had to move quickly. What was the solution? Simple. Get the water out of the basement. The problem, though, is it had to be done manually from within the pools of water themselves. But the concern, as Legasov and Yelena confirm,
the water in these ducts, the level of radioactive contamination.
They'll likely be dead in a week.
On May the 6th, 1986, 3 men, sometimes called the Suicide Squad, but also known as the Divers, were sent into the bowels of the reactor hall to accomplish this feat. The title card tells us this happened on April 28th, but forget that. Let's just assume that the timeline is going to be wrong from now on. These men, Alexei Ananenko, Boris Baranov, and Valery Bespalov, were given a yearly stipend of 400 rubles, which was not a lot for the time I checked, and the promise that their families would be cared for if they died on the mission. Now, the scene didn't quite play out like this, but Mazen does admit he embellished it a little to give more honor to these men. But regardless, they did what needed to be done to prevent the deaths of tens of millions of people. These guys were real heroes. And just like we see in the show, and as we know in real life, they succeeded. But despite the assumption that these men would die, all 3 of them lived and survived into the 21st century. Boris Baranov died of a heart attack in 2005, but as far as we know, the other 2 are still alive. But this wasn't the last crisis that Legasov and his team would face. Although they drained the pools, the corium was still burning its way through the basement, and the concrete pad separating the plant from the ground. It posed a threat to the entire water supply. as we see Shabina tell Gorbachev
that the fuel will breach the pad and melt down into the groundwater itself.
Yeah. And where does this groundwater go?
The Pripyat River, which feeds into the Dnieper. The primary water supply for approximately 50 million people, not to mention crops and livestock, would be unusable.
What was the solution? To dig a massive underground tunnel, install a heat exchanger to lower the core temperature, and fill it with liquid nitrogen, preventing the corium from getting into the water supply. And so 400 Soviet miners were enlisted to get the job done. They worked around the clock in 3 shifts for a month and 4 days to excavate a space under the reactor hall. The temperatures were oppressively hot, and the show gets its message across very clearly.
Well, they wouldn't give us fans. It's too hot for clothes. So we're digging the old way. This is where our fathers mined.
When it comes to the question if it's true these miners did their job naked, well, the sources differ. One mentioned that the miners were only half naked, but Sergei Sobolev, deputy head of the executive committee of the Shield of Chernobyl Association, said that the miners were working naked in a 50 degrees Celsius heat, or 122 Fahrenheit. But another source for Major General Nikolai Tarakanov, who we meet in episode 4, disputes the naked miners in an interview that came out after the show aired. So there you go. Maybe they did work naked, maybe they didn't. But what's true in both the show and in real life is that the miners were not properly warned of the true extent of the danger. So not wearing protective gear or respirators did expose them to greater levels of radiation. And in fact, many of the miners later died from radiation sickness or cancer. One source estimates that a quarter of the men died before the age of 40, though it also says that no official studies have been published. But sadly, as one Chernobyl worker said, the miners died for nothing. Everything we did was a waste of time. Because even though the miners accomplished their goal, the core temperature cooled down on its own, and the threat of corium reaching the water supply was resolved without even needing to install the heat exchanger. It was a waste of time, labor, money, and life. But it had to be done. The chance of radioactive materials reaching the water table was high enough to warrant the project. But now at least, the immediate threats were contained. The long, slow war against radiation itself could begin. Some of the most heartbreaking scenes in the show are centered around Lyudmila Ignatenko and her firefighter husband, Vasily. Vasily was one of the first responders, and he was badly irradiated. Lyudmila, concerned for her husband, rushes to find him amongst the sick at the Pripyat hospital. Along the way, we're shown the chaotic reality setting in for the people of Pripyat, like her friends who watch the fallout from the so-called Bridge of Death, who are suffering from radiation sickness, their baby dying in the father's arms. There are so many powerful moments like this, and what I like about the show is that it isn't just science and political cover-ups, it's a very human story, something the showrunners did very well. I do have to say though, not everyone who watched the explosion from the Bridge of Death died from acute radiation sickness, as the credits suggest. It's really just a myth, one repeated so much over time that it's treated as fact. Lyudmila is eventually told that her husband is being transported to Moscow because of the severity of his exposure, and because we've seen that Pripyat just isn't equipped to handle this crisis. This part 2 is accurate. Many of those who were badly irradiated were sent to Moscow's Hospital No. 6, and unfortunately many of them died, including Vasily Ignatenko. And there are some really hard to watch scenes here because Lyudmila is pregnant with her first child. Now, much of the information about Lyudmila, and indeed most of the information for the script, is inspired by a book by Svetlana Alexievich called Voices from Chernobyl, a collection of oral histories by those who survived it. Mazin, captivated by this book, felt especially connected to Lyudmila's story, which is why she was featured in the show. And let me tell you something, her story in Voices from Chernobyl is every bit as heartbreaking as what we see in the show. It opens up with her saying, "I don't know what I should talk about death or about love, or are they the same?" A very poignant line from a woman who watched her husband die, burning from the inside out. And for the most part, HBO's Chernobyl gets her story right. Lyudmila did bribe the woman at the hospital in Moscow to get in to see Vasily. The doctor did caution her about not touching him, but she hugged him anyway. Many of the lines of dialogue between Lyudmila and the female doctor are lifted directly from Lyudmila's account. There are a few narrative changes here and there, but nothing too egregious. Just basic changes to the storytelling to simplify things a bit, like having Lyudmila sleep in the hospital hallway when, in reality, she stayed with friends nearby. But what is really inaccurate, which is something we saw in the first episode as well, is the way they present death by radiation sickness. Now don't get me wrong, it's rough, and it kills your cells and organs from the inside out, but just take a look at the scene.
Yes, my love. Stay. I think I dream. I just gone.
It is beyond horrific. He was laughing and joking just a few days before, looking like himself, but now he's essentially a living corpse. We were told previously in a scene between Legasov and Shabina that this would happen, a few days of normalcy before your cells start to implode, and you die a horrible, painful death. Having said that, the visuals here have been exaggerated. Radiation expert Dr. Alla Shapiro debunks this scene, saying this:
I don't think that this is a realistic to have all this degree of burns and coloring and intensity all over the body. My colleagues who did work in Moscow in hospital number 6 provided me with the pictures of radiation burns, and I never seen anything like portrayed in this. These look like someone really, a painter or artist was doing this without any solid knowledge or experience.
And there you have it. Mazen shed some light on his choices here, saying the head of the makeup department did his research, relying heavily on Lyudmila's account of what her husband looked like. But I think in this instance, an account from a grieving widow who's lost the love of her life might be biased from the sheer trauma of watching her husband die, so I'd side with the experts on this one. Now, Lyudmila was 6 months pregnant at this point, but her character in the show clearly isn't. Despite how heartbreaking the scene is, Lyudmila didn't need to tell Vasily they're going to have a baby, because in real life he already knew. And when she does eventually give birth to a baby girl named Natasha, the baby dies soon after. However, it's important to note that being near her husband did not cause the baby to get sick and die. This is probably one of the show's biggest inaccuracies. The thing is, patients with acute radiation sickness are not contagious to adults, pregnant women, or babies. Their clothes, however, would have been, is why the doctors in Pripyat removed them and stashed them in the basement. So, although Vasily was dying from acute radiation sickness, that would not have transferred to Lyudmila or his unborn daughter. But neither Lyudmila or the doctors would have known that. Medical schools did not train their doctors on the effects of radiation. Now, interestingly, the real Lyudmila in her account claims that her baby saved her by absorbing the radiation. There's a scene between Yulana, Shabina, and Legasov where Yulana references this.
They said the radiation would have killed the mother, but the baby absorbed it instead. The baby lived for 4 hours.
However, our resident expert, Dr. Shapiro, debunks this claim.
It's a medical fiction that fetus can absorb radiation. There is no science behind it. It's not like my opinion. I would say there is no science behind saying very inaccurate thing that fetus would absorb the radiation and die, but protect his mother.
Now, I don't blame Lyudmila for believing this. After all, she's a civilian, and this is not her field of expertise. Anyway, once Vasily dies, we see his body bundled up in plastic, placed in a zinc coffin, and buried under a layer of concrete. Which is true. People were afraid that their bodies would contaminate the water table and surrounding environment. Of course, we now know that it doesn't work that way, but people were scared at the time. The show does get this part absolutely right and nails it once again with visuals and sound design. It was hard to watch in all the best ways. Once the initial threats of explosion were over, the next step was liquidation. As Legasov tells the Commission in this scene,
there is an enormous amount of radioactive debris and contamination spread out across a zone of approximately 2,600 square kilometers. This entire region must be completely evacuated. We must go to every town, every village to ensure this. All animals still surviving within the zone, whether domesticated or wild, must be presumed contaminated and will have to be destroyed to prevent the spread of radiation and disease.
Legasov continues that the ground itself will need to be dug up and turned over. It took years of work, and liquidators came from all across the Soviet Union to help with the cleanup. The bulk of the 4th episode covers some of these liquidation efforts. The part I won't dwell on is the whole section with Barry Keoghan over here, hunting down and shooting dogs, the pets left behind in the evacuation. These scenes are brilliant, but they are so hard to watch. And they're peppered with cool little details, like the homemade lead plates the men wore to protect themselves from radiation.
We make these from lead scrap. Put it on your bowls.
This is all pretty accurate stuff, and Mazin cobbled the story together from oral accounts in voices from Chernobyl, like he did with Lyudmila and Vasily Ignatenko's story. The other main aspect of liquidation we see in the show is clearing radioactive debris from the roof of the reactor hall. This was necessary because the reactor hall itself needed to be contained and housed, or it would continue to spew radioactive particles into the air. Legasov explains this to General Tarakhanov, who was in charge of part of some of the liquidation efforts.
Why is the core still exposed to the air? Why have we not already covered this up?
We want to, but we can't get close enough. The debris on the roof is graphite from the core itself. Until we can push it off the roof back into the reactor, it'll kill anyone who gets near it.
And for the most part, this sequence is accurate. What they wanted to install was later called the sarcophagus, a steel and concrete containment structure built from late May to November 1986. It was later covered by the new safe confinement in November 2016 because the sarcophagus was cracked and crumbling from the hasty way it was put together. Think of it like a Russian doll, but with uranium and death on the inside. But in order to build the sarcophagus to enclose the still open reactor core, liquidators had to clear the chunks of graphite and other irradiated materials from the 3 roofs surrounding the reactor hall. The idea was that all of the contaminated soil, debris, and reactor fuel would be enclosed within the structure. They could use robots to clear debris from 2 of the roofs. But the 3rd level of radiation was much too strong, anywhere between 10,000 and 12,000 Röntgen. First, they tried bringing in lunar rovers. The bright yellow one we see in the show is Joker, brought in from West Germany. But unfortunately, just like we see in the show, the robots failed pretty quickly. Why?
The official position of the state is that a global nuclear catastrophe is not possible in the Soviet Union. They told the Germans that the highest detected level of radiation was 2,000 Röntgen. They gave them the propaganda number. That robot was never going to work.
This, unfortunately, is true. The Soviet Union wasn't willing to admit that their reactor exploded, and because the state was unwilling to show weakness in the face of their enemies, they lied about the amount of radiation, and ended up with a robot that would never have worked. The radiation was 5 to 6 times stronger than what the Soviets told the Germans. Faced with no other options in clearing the roof of debris, the team had to go with something they tried desperately to avoid.
Bio-robots. What was that?
We use bio-robots. Men.
Starting on September 19th, 1986, teams of men were sent out onto the roof. They were given a short time limit to shovel as much debris as possible over the edge of the roof into the reactor hall. One source says it was 40 seconds, another claims up to 3 minutes. And the show itself says 90 seconds. General Tarakhanov then gives his men instructions on what to do and how to do it, and we're treated to some excellent cinematography in the sequence. Each man was only supposed to go out once, but some felt compelled to go multiple times. In total, 3,828 men over 12 days accomplished the mission. These biorobots were successful in clearing the roof of radioactive graphite. With this task completed, the sarcophagus could be installed over the open reactor core, something we don't see on screen because the show needs to resolve its other main problem: why the reactor exploded. Because apparently RBMKs don't explode. We get this little exchange between Legasov and Yulana in the 3rd episode.
There's something I've wanted to ask you, comrade, but I see you're already asking yourself the same question.
Why did it explode? I've worked the numbers over and over, presuming the worst possible conditions in an RBMK reactor. And I always get the same answer.
Which is?
It's not possible.
And yet.
The show then has Yulana going around interviewing the men in the control room that night: Dyatlov, Toptunov, and Akimov. Since Yulana's not a real character, we know that all these scenes are made up. But from speaking with these men, Yulana starts to put the picture together, and she's shocked when Toptunov tells her that he's the senior engineer, despite being only 25. And that was part of the problem, right? They weren't trained properly and didn't have enough experience to run the safety test. But it was when Toptunov told Yulana that the explosion happened, after Akimov pressed the scram button, the emergency shutdown that pushed all the control rods into the core, that Yulana figures out the design flaw: the graphite-tipped control rods. Towards the end of the 4th episode, we find out that Legasov is being sent to a conference at Vienna, a meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. And at Vienna, Legasov was supposed to tell the truth about what happened with the RBMK reactor at Chernobyl. In the show, it's Yulana who gives the information to Legasov, but he already knew.
You've seen this before.
Please, believe me when I tell you that I had no idea it could cause an explosion. None of us knew.
None of you knew what?
In 1975, at an RBMK reactor at Leningrad, a fuel channel ruptured. The operators pressed AZ5, but instead of the power going down immediately, for a brief moment, it went up.
And this 1975 event, by the way, is completely accurate. Not this conversation, though, since Yulana isn't a real person.
How is that possible?
Well, this is the very question posed by a colleague of mine named Volkov. He's the one who wrote this article. When an RBMK reactor runs at low power, it's notoriously unstable, prone to swings in reactivity. Under normal circumstances, the control rods can compensate for that.
Under normal circumstances, the Chernobyl staff stalled the reactor during the test. They pulled almost all the control rods out to bring the power back up.
This is what Volkov learned from Leningrad. If the boron control rods are completely withdrawn from the reactor, when they're put back in, the first thing that enters the core isn't boron. It's graphite.
And that is what led to the explosion. The RBMK faults, like everything else, were kept secret so as not to make the Soviet scientific industry and their own Soviet-designed reactors look inferior. So the blame falls on both the operators that night, who pushed the reactor too hard, and the state itself, who covered up the reactor's faults. When Legasov speaks at the IAEA conference, which happens off-screen, he maintains the party line. Of this decision, the real Legasov said, and I quote, "I did not lie in Vienna, but I did not tell the whole truth." Now, there's something interesting I found with what actor Jared Harris, who plays Legasov, said when he was researching his character.
And my impression of the real Legasov was that he was actually in that sort of traditional Russian alpha personality. Mm-hmm. You know, he came across as actually very confident, and he occupied his space. But that didn't work really for what Craig needed to happen in our story and the journey that our two characters were going to take.
He then goes on to say how he didn't want his character to operate in the same sphere as Shabina, which is why they all collectively decided to change his character arc. The truth is, Legasov was much more complicated than the show makes him out to be. He's presented as the typical hero archetype, someone who risked everything to go against a corrupt system, but that just isn't accurate to the real history.
Legasov was a rather zealous member of the party. He was considered a real Soviet, and a loyalist and somebody that you could count on to just, toe the party line.
The truth is, Legasov wasn't this underdog hero fighting back against the machine. He was a part of the machine. Mazin has said as much in his podcast, and yet he builds Legasov's character as if he doesn't know what he's up against. Just take a look at the scene from episode 3.
Forgive me. Maybe I just spent too much time in my lab. Or maybe I'm just stupid. Is this really the way it all works? An uninformed, arbitrary decision that will cost who knows how many lives made by some apparatchik, some career party man?
Yes, Legasov, it does work that way, and you know it works that way because you're one of them. This is one of my biggest gripes in an otherwise brilliant show. The showrunners changed the narrative and these very real characters to tell their own story. The show is guilty of committing the very same crimes it pins on the Soviet Union. The cost of lies, and the problems that come when someone controls the narrative. This is most evident in the final episode of the trial, where Legasov and Shabina lay out what happened at Chernobyl, highlighting the RBMK's faults. And Legasov finally reveals to the court that the Soviet system was partly responsible for what happened. And although this is a well-written scene and it does a great job of detailing what went wrong for a common audience, it's completely made up. Not only was the government's role in covering up the RBMK's faults not brought up at the real trial, but Legasov and Shabina weren't even there. So most of what we see in this final episode is just Hollywood fiction. Mazin defends this decision in its podcast by saying this.
An enormous dramatic license here that I take in 5 out of necessity.
Right.
I could have absolutely portrayed this trial exactly as it unfolded with other people, but we wouldn't have known who they were.
Right.
And we wouldn't have cared. So this is dramatic license. He was not there. Sherbina was not there. Other people handled this.
Fair enough. I did appreciate seeing a recreation of what the control room was like in the moments leading up to the explosion. These flashback sequences were the best parts of the final episode. Since the show began with the aftermath of the explosion, it feels like we've earned the flashback by this point, and we're better equipped to understand what went wrong. So even though this whole trial is fictional, it tries to narrate a very real event and break it down in a way that makes sense to the viewer, and I can respect that. In reality, at the trial, 6 men were charged, only 3 of which appear in the show. Anatoly Dyatlov was sentenced to a maximum of 10 years in prison. He worked hard from prison to shift the blame to the faulty reactor design, but he was still blamed for deviating from procedure, flaunting safety protocol, and generally poor decision making. He was given early release in 1990 due to his failing health, and ultimately died from bone marrow cancer in 1995. Nikolai Fomin attempted suicide several times from his arrest to the trial, so the trial itself was delayed. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was released early for health reasons and transferred instead to a psychiatric hospital. And get this, after he left the hospital, he went to work for another nuclear power plant. He retired in 2000 and is still alive today. Viktor Brukhanov was also sentenced to 10 years, but got off in 1991 for good behavior. He died in 2021. Toptunov and Akimov would have been sentenced, but they died in hospital from the extreme amount of radiation they absorbed in the hours after the explosion. Like we saw on the show, the 2 stayed to try and help out any way they could. The other 3 who didn't appear in the show were Boris Rogoshkin, the station ship supervisor of the night shift, Alexander Kovalenko, the reactor division chief, and Yuri Loshkin, the inspector. They got 5 years, 3 years, and 2 years in a labor camp, respectively. Now, despite all the inaccuracies and fiction, there are some good storytelling moments in this final episode. Seeing Legasov and Shabina have that moment where they support and acknowledge each other's part to play in history is just an awesome scene.
I'm an inconsequential man, Valera. That's all I've ever been. I hoped that one day I would matter, but I didn't. I just stood next to people who did.
There are other scientists like me. Any one of them could have done what I did. With you, everything we asked for, everything we needed. Men, material, lunar rovers. Who else could have done these things? Of all the ministers and all the deputies, the entire congregation of
obedient fools. They mistakenly sent the one good man. God's sakes, Boris. You were the one who mattered most.
Boris Shabina died in 1990, age 70, from cancer, an effect of working so closely around radiation while he orchestrated Chernobyl's cleanup. And as we know from the beginning, Valery Legasov committed suicide 2 years and 1 day after the explosion. His health was failing, he was discredited by the Soviets for eventually speaking out against the RBMK reactor design, and he was denied awards and promotions. Most agree that these all factored into his decision to end his life. The show ends where it began, with one of Legasov's fictional audio tapes and the phrase, "What is the cost of lies?" Now, despite some of its faults, whether intentional or not, I have to admit this show is an absolute masterpiece in terms of its cinematography, sound design, acting, visuals, and storytelling. Even with the narrative changes. I mean, just look at this scene. Absolutely epic. It's dark, it's scary, and the sound design? Well, just have a listen. Sitnikov here knew that staring into the open reactor core would likely kill him, but he did it anyway because his superiors told him to. It's a perfect metaphor for what the show is telling us about the grip the Soviet Union had over its own people and their irresponsibility playing with nuclear power. The acting across the board is top-notch as well. There are so many examples to choose from, but these two stood out to me the most. First, when Toptonov cries to Akimov while manually opening the water valves. It's a touching moment in the first episode, shocked that they caused the explosion, even though, as we learn later, they did everything right. And even though they knew opening the valves wouldn't help, and they'd exposed themselves to deadly amounts of radiation, they did it anyway, because they felt it was their duty and they followed orders. And second, there's the touching scene where Yulana wipes the blood away from a dying Toptonov's face as he tells her what he did. So much of the show is brilliantly acted, but it's these small moments of humanity where it excels the most. And though I may be a bit frustrated at some of the creative liberties, I will admit that the storytelling is excellent. Starting with Legasov's suicide and the reactor's explosion, and not really telling us what happened until the end, keeps us engaged and invested. However, some of Chernobyl's more creative embellishments do lay it on a little thick. I mean, dying from acute radiation sickness is scary enough, without having to make it ridiculously gory. But despite that, Chernobyl is an incredible historical drama. It presents an authentic, mostly accurate look at the Soviet Union and how it handled Chernobyl's explosion. It does justice to the characters involved, even if it sometimes exaggerates the truth. But overall, it's a powerful story and a visual masterpiece. Well, that about wraps it up. Once again, thanks to our sponsor, Game of Thrones Legends. You can go ahead and download the game through the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, then you can now do so at Patreon. And as always, let me know in the comment section what you thought about Chernobyl. And of course, what historical movie should I review next? In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.